Much of your karma is hardwired into your brain. There's a process called myelination that shows how this works. I'll talk about that and a few other things in this video. I'm talking about a process in the brain called myelination, and it shows where certain responses are hardwired. The way to understand myelination, aside from the initial stages of myelination, which takes place in utero in a child's brain, in a baby's brain, it's actually the process through which you have these deeply hardwired responses that refer back even into your childhood and your, deeply held convictions that then trigger a neural muscular response and a sort of default triggering and button getting pressed. What happens in the brain with this process of myelination is it's like paving a road. And the example is this. If let's say that you're walking through the woods and there's a river that is off the beaten path, and you try to find a shortcut to this river off the beaten path, and you walk it by yourself, there's no path yet, and you have to clear away all the brush, and you have to, create this new path. But let's say that it's you and 200 people. If you're first, you might be, having to clear away all the weeds, but by the time the 200th person has also walked this path, it will then be a path. It won't just be one sort of clunky groove. There will be a path that will then be hardwired, you might say. Think of your brain the same way. Your brain is really a system of neural pathways that connect different stimuli and external experience with a neurological response, which is like a feeling and an emotion, and then a physical response. So external stimuli comes in, creates a response in your brain, which you might experience as an emotion, and then something physical happens, like you might start to sweat, or you might get excited. It might release dopamine or an endorphin, or something like adrenaline or cortisol, fight or flight responses. All of these things, well, not all of these things, but certain responses like this are really hardwired. Again, because the process of myelination is deep. Like, for example, especially those things that have to do with survival. It won't take you long to recognize that, fire will burn you, so you don't want to get too close to fire. It's not something that you logically consider. Or seeing something like a snake or a deadly animal, or even just an animal you've never seen, will automatically trigger a hardwired response. And this is because that stimuli there's a process of myelination in the brain that goes straight to your survival centers. So the reason this is important is because we're also programmed deeply at a young age, of course, to react to actual dangerous stimuli like snakes and fire, but we also wind up hardwired to imagined situations. For example, all those buttons that get pushed in you that are irrational, like, let's say when you were younger, very typical thing is like one of our parents was mean to us. Let's say that our father was, cruel to us and he would hit us or something like that. And it would happen after a certain thing, like let's say that he would drink. Then we would recognize a change in his behavior, and we knew that that was dangerous. We might have that response, or the response to that stimuli of, let's say, someone drinking, or even someone's behavior starting to change, someone slurring their words. That response, or that stimuli, would be there's a myelination groove right to your fight or flight response. So even as you grow up, let's say someone's slurring their speech a little bit, or someone even appearing like they might be drunk a little bit, will bring out a primal fight or flight response in you because of the myelination path, even if there's no danger. Now that's one that's even a little more recognizable, but it could be something as simple as, let's say your father was tall, right? Let's say your father was tall and dark. I don't know, just as an example. Then all tall, dark people could trigger that response. Or let's say your father was, he was a Cancer in astrology, or he was a Capricorn. Oh, Capricorns. And all these irrational kind of ideas, stimuli, or whatever can also be irrationally hardwired through this process of myelination right to our fight or flight responses. Let's say it's, again, some simple things that we wind up doing as we go forward in our life is, let's say, like, I'll give you an example. Like, I grew up, I still have a bit of a stuttering. It's very slight now. You have probably noticed it before, but I used to have a really bad stuttering problem. It was really bad. And it held me back for a very long time. And I would avoid situations because, you know, if there were situations where I thought I would have to speak publicly, I mean, now, look, I run my mouth constantly. But I started to learn to avoid situations where I might have to speak. And so what it did is it created a kind of default sort of failure situation in my mind where even just the, you know, even just the notion or the idea that I might have to speak publicly would create a hardwired kind of avoidance behavior. So, you know, even just the idea that someone might ask me to speak would make me avoid something. And so there was all these things I didn't do because of the possibility that I might have to speak or whatnot. So until I learned that that's not an actual threat to, like, my survival, or people laughing at me and embarrassment and all of that is not an actual threat, I was confined by that hardwired response. Because, again, one of the things I talked about in an earlier video is that those three brains, one of the most compelling, you know, survival instincts is in the mammal brain, which is acceptance. Not being laughed at, not being embarrassed. Public speaking is one of the most scary, you know, one of the scariest things that people go through. And it's not because we feel like a lion is going to eat us, which would be the reptile brain. It's because we're afraid of the disapproval of our tribe. Because on a very primal level, if you're laughed at and ostracized, it could mean death. And on the mammal brain level, being ostracized and being unpopular can irrationally equate to death. Because in chimps, you know, in chimp or in mammal communities, if you're kicked out of the tribe, you're basically dead. So this is why being laughed at, fear of embarrassment, all of these things are in many ways hardwired towards survival instincts. And again, the process is called myelination. So why is this important? Well, you know, what happens physically is there's a thing called the myelin sheath, and it's literally like pavement over the neural pathways. Like the example I used of walking through the woods, it would be like if you were to take that footpath after you've walked through it 200 times and you put cement on it. Now it's like a neural, now there's a myelination path. So there's a direct path from that segment of the brain right to something else. So again, it shortcuts all of the logic and the you know, and the discovery and all of that. It just goes straight to some neural impulse. And so physically it's made of fat. It's like the myelination sheaths are built of, like, I forgot what the physical name of it is, like neuropeptides or something like that, but it's actually built on fatty tissue, which is related to the planet Jupiter. And This is why when you're trying to discover new things, you might not realize this, but you sort of crave fat a little bit. When you're using your brain, it's good to have some oils and some fats in your diet because it facilitates that brain function. Your brain is mainly fat. But more interesting is that there's a way to reprogram this myelination or these myelination paths. There's a thing called neurolinguistic programming, which treats your brain as if it's a computer, and where you reprogram your brain to repave new neural pathways, to create new myelination patterns in the brain. So rather than being this programmed, instinctive person who, like me, would avoid situations and avoid success and expect failure because I might have to talk in front of people because of being afraid of, stuttering and having people laugh, you learn to reprogram that. Now, I will say things like meditation and yoga and these other practices they'll do that naturally. But you can do it also intentionally with something like neurolinguistic programming, where you imagine and you feel yourself in that situation. You feel the stress of that situation. You remember when you were laughed at, and usually you will remember these things. Like I can remember exact moments when the terrorizing embarrassment filled my mind, because we remember these traumatic, whether that's embarrassment or literally trauma of getting hit. Our development is arrested at these levels. We remember those traumatic experiences. So you live that traumatic experience again, or you feel it again, find that moment and really feel it, and then you do something called anchoring. You anchor it in something physical. Like let's say you pinch right here. Let's say if I were to try to do a different neurolinguistic programming, rerouting of the neural pathways, and to, a new myelination pathway, I would remember there was a time I was in 3rd grade. I got up to speak and I started stuttering and everybody was laughing at me, and I would remember the embarrassment. I can remember the faces of a couple of my friends literally laughing and me feeling like I wanted to just die. So you remember that in full force, and then maybe as you remember it, you just sort of pinch yourself there just a little bit. Anchor it, it's called anchoring, to something physical. Then if you're in that situation again where you have to be very present, and you're faced with a situation where you are at a junction point where you might have an opportunity for success, but you have to get up and speak in front of people, and you feel that avoidance, you just pinch yourself and you anchor it. Oh, actually what you do is you relive the experience, but you then remember it. You change the story in your mind. You say, oh, I actually didn't stutter. People didn't laugh. It was okay. So rather than remembering it traumatically, you remember it successfully, and you anchor it with something physical. And you can do this as a kind of practice. This is a very simplistic way. And then when you get in the situation again where you might want to avoid something, you just anchor it in the physical thing, and it can repave that pathway so that you're not just a programmed robot, right? That's how neurolinguistic programming can reroute the myelination paths or create new myelination paths in the brain. Of course, things like meditation and yoga and spiritual practices do it naturally, because you start to see your karma as something that is in your own hands. But your mind and your past experiences are full of these programmed, hardwired samskaras, what are called samskaras. If you want to understand how samskaras, those deeply embedded habits, grooves, patterns, are in your mind, you can understand that through the concept of myelination. These samskaras, which are these deeply held convictions and biases and almost autonomic neural responses to external circumstances. Neuroscience understands it as myelination. These are these deep myelination grooves where something external triggers a deep, almost automatic, unconscious response. And again, one of the ways that in the West that we've approached creating new myelination patterns is through something called neurolinguistic programming. The way the Indians have always done it is through, mantra, meditation, devotion, yoga. That's the remedy really for everything. But the Western equivalent, one of them, is this concept of neurolinguistic programming, where we actually recreate or we create new myelination grooves and patterns in the mind. It's a way to liberate our mind from the grip of those samskaras that have overtaken us. So again, even if we don't do neurolinguistic programming, just understanding the nature of the mind and the way it works is really helpful, because we can get out of just thinking we're this automaton. And so these are some of the things I'm going to be talking more about in the Psychological Astrology weekend. In addition, I also am giving people access to the Moon Yogas course that I taught several years ago, where you understand the nature of the mind and the psychological projections that we put forth, planets before the moon, with the moon, and after the moon. And you get access to that really popular course that works for actually Western or Vedic astrologers, because it's based on the positions of planets before, with, or after the moon. Shows those things that we tend to gravitate towards psychologically, and those things that also really color our emotions. And so very powerful. This is just a bonus class that I'm giving for people who want to attend the Psychological Astrology weekend. But I wanted to talk about myelination, the samskaras in the mind, those deeply held, programmed, almost triggered responses that we all have, and ways to live beyond just acting like a programmed, triggered animal. And how the West has approached this with things like neurolinguistic programming, and how neuroscience explains it as myelination, and how these hardwired responses aren't just, something that we're always going to be at the mercy of. But again, in the East, we can unwind all of that through yoga, meditation, devotion. And even in the West, we've worked with these things in modern times through things like neurolinguistic programming and consciously anchoring new experiences, and reliving these things in a more psychological Western way, as a way to be more engaged consciously with our unconscious programming. So anyway, I hope this was helpful.